Wonderful. Well, thank you, Kim. And next we are going to cover the technicalities of equipping nursing centers with generators. And I really appreciate our panel of experts who are with us. And as I introduce each of you all, would you just please stand up and wave? So our first panelist is Michael Dodane with Migrate Engineers. Thank you. Eric Cody of Powered for Patients. Eric. Mike Acree with Ring Power Corporation. Thank you, Mike. And then David Dodd with Feral Gas. David, give a wave. Well, thank you, panelists. Let's kind of get right to it. Mike, let's start with you. What are the current requirements for generators and fuel for nursing homes?
So under the state statutes at this point, a nursing home is required to have a generator for specific items in the facility and 48 hours of gas. It's not the entire facility, it's lights, some receptacles scattered around elevators, kitchen equipment, and that's about it. No air conditioning is required, but heating it is actually required, lead out from Florida. So it's fairly limited, but it makes the facility fairly operational for a short duration.
Okay. Does anybody want to add to that? Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. The next question I have for our panel is describe what type of generator it takes to fully power a 120-bed nursing home. Yeah.
All right, can I get that slide up? All right, so I will try not to geek out on you too bad here, but you have to get your head around the complexity of the distribution system in these facilities. This would be a typical riser diagram for a 120-bed facility. Everything on the right side is normal power, they call it. So that is lights and receptacles throughout the place, most of the HVAC, kitchen equipment, irrigation wells, everything around the facility. Everything on the left is the emergency systems. So that's the three systems that I kind of just described. You have life safety, which runs lighting and just the egress areas for getting you out of the building. Not in the patient rooms, not in the common areas, it simply gets you out of the building. The next branch is the critical branch. That powers lights and receptacles in specific places, nursing stations, considered patient care areas. Again, not in the rooms, just in places where the staff and the patients interact. The next section is the equipment branch. That runs elevators, refrigeration, and equipment. So there may be some air conditioning on that branch. Those are panel boards scattered throughout the entire facility right there. There are air handlers connected and condensing units connected to any one of those panels throughout the facility. So the concept of backing a generator up and connecting the HVAC to it is very complicated, all right? So if you have to go in and look at this facility and figure out where those connections are made, how to, size a generator, everything else to do that, that's a 45 to 60 day process just to figure out what to do. So each one of those panels on the right side may have 2 or 3 air handlers, the patient care, the patient room, PTACs, the through-wall units that most of these facilities have. So, a blanket statement that you got to hold 80 degrees in there, a little more difficult than you think right now. So it can be done. Throw money at anything and make it happen, right? But you have to really get in and dissect this system in order to figure out how to size that generator and then safely hook it up for future events.
Okay. Thank you. Any other panelists? Okay. Thank you for that. What would the difference be for the sizing requirements if you just cooled a refuge space as opposed to cooling the entire facility?
So, sorry.
You're on the spot.
All the geek questions, thanks. So that is, in a existing facility, it remains the same battle. Your existing plant has to be, you got to figure out where those spots are, pick those branch circuits out of the 22,000 electrical panels around there, and pull that back to a central place to hook it up. It certainly reduces it. Moving forward, it's much easier to plan those things ahead of time, which happens in many assisted living facilities at this point. That's a common design tactic to create neighborhoods, so to speak, where you can gather. It has lights, power, and HVAC in common areas. It can significantly reduce the size of the generator moving forward with new facilities. But to go in and do it to an existing facility requires an immense amount of rewiring and brain power to get that to happen.
Okay. Thank you very much. What is the time frame and process to get through all the channels to upgrade and install a generator in a nursing home? Anybody want to take that one?
Some of what I've worked on here in the past, probably the last 3 years, if I go back that far, I see typically this to be a 6 month to 1.5 year process. If you go through all the current requirements through ACA and through the state, get through that process, have your design completed, and then get released to order equipment for new equipment. So that's what I typically see right now in the 5 or 6 projects I've got going on in healthcare.
Okay.
I would just add, I'd throw probably another 30 to 45 days because once the initial permit's issued to put the power source on the property, then you've got to fuel that power source. And so we would tag on top of that permit with the tank permit, piping over to the generator, and then the testing period.
So there's going to be another panel that's going to talk about the regulatory process and the permitting process. But maybe you could give us a little bit more clarity as to is it a matter of bringing the generator in and hooking up wires into the building? What needs to be physically done to the nursing home to accept a generator of this size as far as construction or wiring or things like that? Maybe you could speak to that?
The AHJ is going to have the final say on that, so the authority having jurisdiction, he's going to be the one to tell us what we have to do. So a lot of times that process takes 6 months to 1 year to get to that point where they can tell us what we need to do to install our equipment. And then from that point is where I get to order the equipment, being a vendor, and get that in and then supplied, commissioned, turned over to the owner. So that's the start of the process. So that's one of the challenges I see with this situation. That's the answer for that.
Okay.
Let me stop there.
Well, I'm going to keep you on the spot here a little bit because I think that the wealth of knowledge you have on this issue is important to be shared. So let me ask you this. Maybe you could think back to a project that you recently completed on a nursing home and maybe kind of walk us through, give us a real-life example and walk us through what you had to do to get a generator hooked up as far as process-wise.
Well, I'll bring in some other processes that don't always entail the vendor too, but from day one they call me, I need a generator on this room of this facility. That's what we're proposing, I suppose. So we bring together a team, an engineer, electrical contractor, and a supplier, and we start working on that. So the engineer's design typically will take 1 to 2 months to put together. Michael? Okay, so once we get that design, we submit that to ACA for review. All right, so they have to review it. A lot of times there'll be interviews that'll be called in, and the engineer, the owner, and the ACA agent will discuss those plans, change those plans, modify, get them to meet the code exactly as they're interpreting it. From that point, I've seen that take 6 months to 1 year. And then from that point is when I get released as a vendor to start ordering my equipment. So I've put all my paperwork together. I've turned in my 1,000 pages of submittal that says, this is what I'm giving you. It's been approved. So I'm released to order at that point. My lead times right now currently are somewhere between 12 and 14 weeks. If it's something like a HVAC enclosure, a hurricane-resistant enclosure, that adds another 4 to 6 weeks to the process because that's a custom-built enclosure. That's not a factory enclosure. It's a Florida-specific item. Just like the fuel tanks in Florida. Most of your fuel tanks in Florida are Florida-specific items because once you get over 550 gallons in Florida, we have our own requirements. So I have to get that equipment built. I get it sent to the job. The electrical contractor installs that 2 to 3 weeks, finishes up what he's already started. We commission the unit a week's time, We bring the engineer, we prove that it works. We go through ACA testing. Sometimes that's more than one trip if there's a problem or error. So I've seen it take 3 or 4 trips to get through commissioning. Once they bless it, we turn it over to the owner, and we put the project in line or in service. And then sometimes if you have multiple branches, like if it's a bigger facility where you have 5 or 6 branches, you're only allowed to bring those over one at a time. So instead of having 3 or 4 trips, you have 8 or 9 trips with ACA. And they bless each step, saying, it's good to go, you've installed it correctly. And I'm not saying there's a problem with that process, I'm just telling you what the process is as of today.
Okay.
So, a year to year and a half to 2 years, depending on the complexity of the project.
So this is all very interesting to me because actually in college I debated whether to be a lobbyist or an electrical engineer. So let me ask one other thing that just came to mind. And so we didn't rehearse this, so I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot. Does the age of the building matter? Because many nursing homes built in Florida are 30 years old or things like that. So does the age of the building matter in this process?
Most of the time, the older the building is, the more complex it is because things are spread out more. I recently toured a facility that we were trying to discuss what they needed for a generator. They were trying to be preemptive and put a whole facility generator in, and it had been built in phases. So there were 5 electrical phases on top of each other. So it wasn't a clean system. Their emergency transfer switches were in 3 different rooms. So, all that kind of stuff has to be addressed. So, that kind of a scenario and solution, you have to be real creative. You have to have some experience in doing that. And, yes, it takes longer to do that. The other issue I see with pushing the 60 days, I know this is off the cuff, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I can regret it later. If we end up rushing this process, what we're going to end up with is used equipment that is not a complete fluid assembly, right? We're going to go out and we're going to get what we can find, and we're going to get a fuel tank that's not going to be big enough because typically if you buy a used unit, it's got a 24 to 48-hour fuel tank, not a 96-hour fuel tank. So I'm going to cobble together a fuel tank, a generator, and all these different pieces, and it's not going to be a working fluid system that's going to give you 20 to 30 years of reliability, right? Storm season ends in a month or so. I've got till June of next year to probably get this process taken care of in a much more efficient way than the 60 days.
Okay. Well, thank you. Is the applause because I picked being a lobbyist instead of an electrical engineer? Is that why you're clapping? Okay, let's move on. Let's move on to the next part of our discussion, and that's to make the generator work, you have to have the fuel, right? And so my question is, how much, so we're talking about a 120-bed facility, right, the average nursing home. How much fuel is required to run a generator for 96 hours?
Well, I think while we were looking at that question, the answer is somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 gallons, which presents a little bit of an issue with storage space, but certainly doable. I mean, we have some VA hospitals that actually run on propane that as a backup for the reason that the product just doesn't go bad as it sits in the tank. That can vary down to the smallest facility that needs 500 gallons for a small hospice facility. So it's that answer will depend obviously on the size of the generator, what the run consumption is going to be. Sorry,
okay,
but while I've got this forum, I wanted to just shout out because I thought the governor took amazing control of this whole process. He allowed us as fuel providers, when he released the DOT regulations where we could run additional hours, to do our job preemptively before the storm hit, get our customers taken care of, because what happens is the generators will run through their course, then you have to come back and fill them again, in this case all over the state, and due to the what I thought was fantastic leadership. He allowed our industry to get ahead of the curve and maintain a good part of the business and be able to keep a lot of facilities going, a lot of cell tower networks running, and the whole thing. So I just wanted to shout out to that. Plus, he looked good in his Navy hat.
Go Navy. We do appreciate the governor. He did amazing leadership in this and did just about everything but drive the fuel trucks. And I'm sure if he had time during the day, he would have done that too. So going back to, that seems like a lot of fuel to me. Tell me, what are the physical requirements to store that much fuel on the property of a nursing home or assisted living?
There's different LP fuel, which is what he's referencing, and then I'm going to reference diesel fuel, which is
LP.
Liquid propane.
Okay.
Diesel fuel being what you're probably going to see in your generators over 200 kW or 150 kW. You're obviously in Florida, anything over 550 gallons is a regulated tank, so you have to have your tank inspected annually. You have to have insurance on it. Per the NFPA 110 code, it says you have to keep a supply of readily available or readily proficient fuel. I forget how it's worded exactly. But so what most hospitals end up doing is they have to test their fuel once a year. There are systems you can buy to where we circulate the fuel. So 96 hours of fuel. What I typically try to tell my customers is try to use your fuel in 1 year. That way we don't have to worry about it going bad. But with 96 hours of fuel, we're going to have more than what you do in a normal storm year where we don't have a storm, where we just exercise our 24 hours a year. So we've got our fuel tank. We've got three quarters of it that's not going to be used. There's conditioner you can add. There's systems you can add. There's companies that do testing and cleaning of fuel. We don't throw diesel fuel away anymore. When it was 75 cents a gallon, it went to the recycler. Well, now we have to clean that fuel. It's a comparable rate. It costs you, a third of what it would cost to replace the fuel to have it clean, and there's companies that do that. And I've watched it happen. It goes from being a nasty dark color to a bright red again and usable fuel. And then they test it to make sure they haven't removed too much from it to where the fuel won't power the engine. So if you get a reputable company. Okay. So have I answered everything yet? Let's see. So we got storage, users, and then you have to have your tank has to be built to the local AHJ codes, right? So if you put your fuel tank outside of a door where it's an emergency egress area, there may be some requirements for that tank to have a 2-hour fire rating and other situations like that. So all that has to be kind of considered into your plan, the layout and where that goes.
If I could just add, so going down the road, whatever fuel you have, and I can only speak to what I have because I'm not that familiar with the diesel industry. I'm going to make a presumption that they have similar equipment. There's a cellular and even satellite monitoring systems that are available for a very nominal fee. Our particular monitor is $400 or $500 and then a monthly activation charge. It ties directly into the gauge of the tank and will send an alert back to the administration of the facility as well as, more importantly, the logistics manager of the fuel company that you're using. And they will be able to see your tank. Let's face it, let's look at the panel before. We might be busy with hundreds of patients or even a few dozen patients that have medical needs. We're not going to have time to run out and check our fuel gauge. And we just know that it's there. We've got lights. We're running. I think these tank monitors are critical, especially in this industry, so that your fuel company doesn't have to be under the gun. They may have trucks, but that truck, as large as counties are in Florida, could be on the other side of the county filling up another desperate need. And with a tank monitor, we can see that your tank is at 40%, it's at 30%. It's time we can see what your burn rate is. We know that we can get there and fill we know what time we have to get to your facility. Now that's, of course, assuming that we don't have trees in our way or a lake that we have to traverse. But all things being equal, those tank monitors can be probably one of the greatest things you all could put on your tanks.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Eric Cody with Powered for Patients. Just want to add to that, there's also generator monitoring technology that's out there in a growing number of hospitals across the United States. So again, listening to the previous panel, underscoring the critical need for situational awareness, there is technology in place that would allow generator status to be known in real time. And that information, if a facility were to agree to share it with government officials during emergencies, could give county emergency managers and state officials real-time visibility into the operating status of generator units, and that could be done at a nursing home or a hospital. And it's something that Florida might want to consider.
Good. Eric, since you got the floor, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about your organization and your programs?
Sure. So Powered for Patients is a 501c3 nonprofit. We've received federal funding, 2 rounds of it. We were established after Hurricane Sandy when 6 New York City area hospitals lost their emergency power. So we've talked a lot about the need to have emergency power. The reality is that even with the best training and maintenance, they can still fail. And so our mission is really to bring together government, healthcare facilities, and utilities to create a platform for accelerated information sharing and collaboration so that when you have a situation like Irma, where there are very scarce resources, not enough generators to go around, not enough fuel to go around, someone in government is going to have to make hard decisions about who gets what. And the best way to make those decisions is to have the best situational awareness you possibly can have, to know who's at the greatest risk and who needs scarce resources. So part of our work is to help create the framework that would allow states or communities to establish that process. We've actually been working in Florida for several months with the Florida Hospital Association, the Florida Healthcare Association, FEPA, on a stakeholder engagement initiative that would address those issues. Of course, Irma slowed us a bit, but we now have the opportunity to step back and expand our scope to address Irma's lessons learned. We received funding from the Department of Homeland Security about a year ago, and in the state of Rhode Island, we were able to develop this really great playbook on safeguarding emergency power. And it provides explicit instructions for everybody from a wrench turner to the governor in terms of responsibilities before, during, and after disaster to safeguard emergency power and accelerate utility power restoration. So looking forward to working here in Florida to help address lessons learned. Florida has always been the tip of the spear in this country in terms of disaster preparedness. And it was said earlier, networks are key, relationships are key. So you have a great position to advance from in terms of making things even better, given that you're already doing so much.
Okay, and Eric, I'm sure you got a website that people can see.
Yes, of course. It's
There you go.
poweredforpatients.org. This playbook that I just referenced, even though it was has a nice friendly message from the governor of Rhode Island, who I don't think was in the Navy, about 80% of the information in this book is really relevant to any facility in the country. So I would say one of the other really important pieces, and I'm sure Mike can speak to this, maintenance is so important. Generator safety and maintenance is critical to lessen the number of calls that are made saying our generator isn't working. One of the other things we do in Rhode Island, we asked every hospital to take an emergency power system vulnerability survey. I wasn't privy to the specific facility results because facilities were very sensitive, understandably, about who was going to see that information. But Brian Kuhn's counterpart in Rhode Island got the report. And there were several red flags that we uncovered. For example, half of the hospitals did not know explicitly what the protocol was with their utility in terms of how to accelerate the restoration process. They didn't know what physical, electrical system safety measures needed to be undertaken to hasten restoration. So it's a perfect example of just an opportunity to get stakeholders to communicate, identify gaps, and develop plans to close gaps.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eric. We appreciate that information. So I received a number of questions along the same line, and I'm just going to summarize a number of questions. What it's asking is that the timeline that you are laying out is beyond the 60 days that is in the emergency rule. So the question is there anything that the nursing homes can do short of the full process in the 60 days to try to comply with the rule
I think,
safely?
Mike, if you'll agree with this statement, everything that we do is governed by our authority having jurisdiction. And we'll do whatever we're allowed to do to speed this process. I think it's great that the governor has made this edict and is requiring this requirement, something that we probably should have done years ago. So I'm for that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't have generators. What I'm saying is either we're going to have to streamline the process, change the process, or something. The process we have today for a life safety generator, I don't, is what I explained.
Okay.
So don't want to be Debbie Downer or anything, but literally to go in and look at these systems takes 45 to 60 days to get your head around how to capitalize on your existing systems. You certainly can. There is generators there already. You need to understand what their loads are, if there's some way to move air conditioning systems onto the equipment branch that are already there. You have capacity for that already. But that's a process you have to go through, and meter panels, see what the loads are already, find out how loaded your current generator is, because all these facilities already have generators, just there's no air conditioning connected to them. So there's possibility that you could go in and create your islands like we were talking about, and find a common area that you can connect to those. And that would be a fairly quick fix, but it still takes some time to figure out how to do that safely and not overload a generator and take the rest of your life safety systems out. So there are patches that can be made fairly immediately, but again, it takes getting in, dissecting, and we were talking about older facilities. I've been involved with some of these, going in and trying to either put a main generator or whatever, and the we'll call it evolution of the electrical systems in these facilities can be frightful. That things just get connected randomly throughout the years, to nobody's fault. They needed something, they put it on a panel. So the evolution, we call it, is something you really have to look at. You look at a set of plans from 20 years ago and then go look at the facility. Yeah, they're similar. I'll give it that. Beyond that, you really have to understand what is on those panels. So you have to you can meter them to figure out their loads, exactly what's going on in them. But that takes time. I mean, you have to run it for 20 to 30 days in order to actually understand the highs and lows of the load on that panel.
Yeah.
So there are some fairly quick fixes that you could put some Band-Aids on it. But again, to do it safely, you have to enter it, and take your time to do it right.
And I would just echo that as one of the FHCA staff who worked in the State Emergency Operations Center during the hurricanes, staying in contact with our nursing homes. I think the generator problems that we did see was when generators were overloaded with spot coolers and they shut down or they blew fuses or things like that. So that really does hit home, because when we had generator issues in EOC, it was exactly that. They overloaded the generator. So it's a good point. So let me ask a follow-up to that. Even if facilities do meet the new requirements, will the current staff be able to maintain the new systems? And if they can't, is there sufficient capacity from vendors to provide the required maintenance?
I represent a company that's in the service business besides just the sales business. We have over 100 technicians in Florida. We have them dispersed over 18 different branches, so we cover the state fairly well. The one thing I would suggest is get a local service provider. You don't need one that's 600 miles away to service your generator during a hurricane in Florida. And that's my opinion. But local's nice. I have 8 guys in Tallahassee, and during the last 2 storms we had, they all worked. They supported our local people. I went out and we saw facilities. We saw how people were doing. We made sure that everything was operating correctly. And it was great to see the plan come together. So yes, there are companies that do maintenance, that can do maintenance. I would suggest, that it be subbed out, that most facilities probably don't have the resources unless they're a multiple facility vendor to where they can have somebody that's their generator expert or their go-to people.
If I could just chime in, I'm just curious to know, so during Irma, were any of your customers without service because of resource constraints placed on you and your team by the storm?
I don't know that we track the hours it took us to get to a call, but our normal call out is less than 4 hours. In the storm situation, we saw all of our regular customers that had open accounts and that we could do business with. So we did not lack anybody. We had it covered.
Okay. Well, I got to tell you, I'm getting a handful of really good questions. There are a lot of other closet electrical engineers in the audience. So with that, let me ask this next question. What would be the physical dimensions for a tank to power a 120-bed facility for 4 days? Are there environmental concerns if the tank is compromised, i.e. flooding or barrier island, and then also contamination of standing water?
To address the size of it, you have to, the size of the generators to start with, which drives the size of the tank. So 120 bed, under current codes of life safety, critical, and equipment branch, you'd be about 125 kW generator. If you want to do the whole facility generator, now you're up to a 350 to 400 possibly. That'd be about right. So I'm going to size it, and I'll let them talk to the size of the tank.
For the 125 kW generator we talked about, we're in the 1,000-gallon tank range. Most fittings on a fuel tank are on the top. So most tanks are 18 to 24 inches tall. So you do have that buffer. I've had locations at the coast where we elevate the tank, we put it up high. You can try sealing the top of the tank. There is some luck with that strategy. So the biggest thing is to make sure your day tank or anything like that is not below grade or in a basement or something along those lines. But that's a Sandy lesson. So we don't have that problem nearly as much in Florida. We don't have many basements. So on the 300 kW generator, we're in the 3,000, 3,500 gallon range. So it's a much bigger tank. It spreads out. Most installations do what they call a sub-base tank. The tank sits under the generator. So everything's one package, one footprint. And it's the same thing. It's 36 inches tall or so. So the fittings are on the top. So you do have that leeway. It should be, it can be anchored to the concrete slab to where it's foundation in place.
So a 300 to 400 kW generator footprint is, I'm going to say, 8 feet wide, 15 feet long, and with a big tank like that, 9 to 10 feet tall. They're tanks.
Or 12, 15 feet long. I mean, sometimes we go out the side. You can go wide and long, but
That's right, and you'd see that as a gas equivalent or liquid petroleum gas equivalent. 1,000-gallon tank is approximately 48 inches by 16 feet. And that can be buried. That can also be, we have engineered tie-down systems for wind and for water mitigation.
Okay. Let me ask next, fuel. Can you talk about the choice of fuels and the best choice during a disaster? I heard they cut off natural gas during Katrina. Is that true?
I can't verify that either way. I've heard the same story about Katrina. I think the question that came back through you guys today from the questions asked by ACA is they're going to stick to the onsite fuel. They're not going to allow piped natural gas. So, there was an email sent out this morning. If you didn't get it, get on that mailing list. It answered that question from ACA. So as of today, you have to have onsite fuel. So onsite fuel is diesel fuel or LP gas. As I mentioned, LP gas, usually on the generators that I sell, ends at about 100 kW, 150 kW. So that means everything over that would be diesel fuel. We do not do gasoline for volatility and power. Diesel has the most torque. It responds to the load better. That's kind of the industry standard for backup standby generators.
Okay. Okay. Next question is, what is the lead time on ordering a new generator? I have heard it is at least 8 months lead time.
Depends on the generator and the equipment. I mentioned complexity with particular enclosures and packaging. If you have to do a hurricane-resistant enclosure and package that adds 6 to 8 weeks to the process. But current lead times are between 12 and 16 weeks to get a factory approved generator package.
Okay. And then there's actually a follow-up to that question, and that is, how does the disaster in Texas, Irma, Maria, and Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, affect the facility obtaining a generator? In other words, are we seeing any sort of shortage of generators or increase in cost because of demand from all the disasters?
From what I know, most manufacturers don't build stock inventory, right? We don't go out and we build 3,000 generators and have them in a warehouse somewhere. When you order one, we're like Amazon. That doesn't happen. We're built to order, one, because of the complexity of the project. You can't tell me what you need for me to keep it in my warehouse. There's different accessories, there's different features, different functions that are required by the AHJ and that we have to put in for just different areas of Florida. I can't put the same generator in Tallahassee that I put in Miami. It's a different package product. So everything's built to order. So that process right now is anywhere between 8, 12, 14, 16 weeks, depending on the size and the complexity of the generator.
Okay.
So everybody has to remember, these are not home-driven generators. These are the size of your car. This is not something that they keep on the shelf.
Or a semi-truck going down the road, depending on how, if I do a 2 meg unit, that's 40-foot ISO container.
Okay, thank you. The next thing is, are there any issues with large storage tanks in high-density areas?
AHJ. The local fire marshal will deem what he allows and where he'll allow it. Sometimes you are landlocked, at facilities. If you don't have the place to put a fuel tank, the size of this stage at your facility, yes, it can be challenging.
I could just jump in on that. So a lot of people in the room probably know that the federal government has a new set of rules for healthcare facility emergency preparedness taking effect this November. And the feds have addressed the 96-hour fuel issue, and they essentially want facilities to have that capability, but they also say that if you cannot meet that, evacuation is an acceptable alternative approach. And the reason the feds, as I understand it from experts, adopted that approach is because in some areas, take for example inner city areas with huge medical facilities, they can't physically find the space for these enormous fuel tanks that will be needed to run for 96 hours. So this is, I think, unique to Florida that this 96-hour requirement is going to be in place. The feds have seen it differently, again, just because of the logistical challenges of siting a 96-hour fuel tank.
And I would just add that the propane industry, the LP industry, is subject to fire protection code, and that code calls for on 1,000-gallon vessels to be 25 feet from the property line, 25 feet from the building. If it's the only tank on the property, then we can get within 10 feet of the property line. So there are code standards, and most of the times we do not have an issue meeting NFPA standards.
Okay. The next question goes along the lines of tanks too, and that is, so if you have an existing tank on your nursing home but it's not large enough for 96 hours of fuel, can a buddy tank be added on at the site and pumped into the existing tank?
Oh, absolutely. They can be manifolded together. If you have, we can manifold without incurring state inspections. We can manifold up to 3 1,000-gallon tanks together. Once we get to a fourth, it is an annual inspection by the state inspector, which is run by the Florida Department of Agriculture here in Florida. And as far as smaller vessels, we can put up to 4 together without any issue.
So that's liquid propane. Diesel fuel, you'd have a tank that you would sit next to it and would have to have some kind of, if you want an automatic system, it'd be a transfer system between the 2 tanks. That's not the most robust system. I prefer to have a single tank for everything to pull out of, less point of failure, but I mean, it's not prohibited in the regulation.
Okay. And I guess you had talked about an evaluation done on the existing nursing home equipment. So what happens when a nursing home has an older generator or maybe their electrical plant panels are below in a floodplain. What has to be done with the nursing home at that point with their older equipment?
They're kind of stuck with their existing physical plant. You can obviously raise things, generators and such. Electrical panels are in walls, fully wired. They're not moving. That kind of comes all the way back to the utility transformers generally sitting on the ground as well, so it's in the floodplain. I can't say there's a lot to do in existing physical plants other than possibly raise the generator. But if your switchgear is in the floodplain, I don't know how to get around that. There are methods of, I'm going to say waterproofing or flood-proofing a room that your equipment could be in. We've done that like on beachside condos and stuff where, obviously these things could get flooded. I don't know how easy that would be to come back in an existing facility to do, but I don't see a lot of options in raising electrical equipment out of the floodplain.
Is that a lengthier process than just putting in a whole new system?
Well, if the facility is in the floodplain, that's where the electrical panels are. So I don't know how you can isolate the two, unless you put everything on the roof, and that's not going to be so pretty. I don't see how you would get around that.
Okay. All right. We're going back to fuels. And so the next question is, would factory-approved biofuel, diesel and natural gas, help reduce the amount of on-site diesel fuel since the run times are extended substantially?
I'm assuming what they're meaning is natural gas injection on a diesel engine, or are we talking about biodiesel fuel? If we're talking about biodiesel fuel you don't want to have in a standby generator. It does not store well. It's susceptible to freezing and other things. If you don't use biodiesel, it gels. It has all kind of other problems and issues it creates. And the fuel lines have to be specially made for biodiesel. Biodiesel does not void our manufacturer's warranty if you use it, only if we find a failure that it caused. As far as injecting gas into a diesel engine and reducing the amount of diesel fuel you use, there are systems on the market that do that, where they take and they add partially gasify a diesel engine, and they put 40-50% of the BTU content for the engine into it with natural gas, and that is a solution. But once again, it's not an on-site fuel source, so it's not going to get you by your 96 hours.
Okay. Good.
And you can't do it with LP that I know of.
Okay. Thank you. Eric, this next question's for you. Do you have a post-assessment evacuation tool to be used across various entities, like long-term care facilities, corporate offices, utilities, things like that?
We don't really address evacuation. We don't really address evacuation. We only address in the context of if emergency power fails and you can't replace emergency power or get utility power restored, we know that evacuation will be a last resort, but we're not focused on helping facilities plan for or execute evacuations.
Okay. Okay, this next one is a 100 kilowatt generator with a 600-gallon tank running on half load with cool zones, so not the entire facility. I'm thinking the runtime should surpass 96 hours. Am I correct? I'll answer that one. No, I'm kidding.
What was the fuel tank size again?
Okay, so the question is, this person has a 100 kilowatt generator with a 600-gallon tank running on half load with cool zones, so not the entire 120-bed facility. I'm thinking the runtime should surpass the 96 hours. Am I correct?
Okay, I'll do the math so y'all can check my math. I am under the spotlight here. 100 kW generator, 100% load burns 7.5 gallons an hour. So 50% load or 50 kW is half of that. So 3.5 gallons times, divided by his tank capacity of 600. I got 160 hours the first round through. You can only use 90% of your tank capacity, right? Because in Florida we only fill to 95. We don't. And then the last 5% is usually the pickup tube on the bottom. So if you've got 500 and, what is it, 10, 60, you got 540 gallons of usable fuel, so 540 divided by 3.75. 144 hours, somewhere in that neighborhood. But
Okay.
did I confuse everyone enough?
I could have done that.
You're absolutely right as far as that fuel consumption is concerned, but the code requirement for that generator, generator and the fuel supply for it, based on 100% load, it says that.
Tom.
That being said, you have to take into consideration on-site fuel or the rating of the generator itself. Like,
For a full load, is what they're asking.
full load on 6 gallons.
Yeah, these are regulatory too. Okay,
That wasn't the question I answered, but anyway, go ahead.
okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's something we'll have to take up with the AHJ when you submit your plans. Your fuel tank's on there, and he'll approve it or disapprove it.
Okay. Some of you submitted questions that I didn't read, and the reason why I didn't, they're more of the regulatory process questions. So we're going to save those for the next panel. So for some of you who submitted questions and I didn't read it, it's really because it's more for the next panel, and we will shift your questions to the next panel. The next question for you all, is there any green fuel alternative options such as solar, wind, etc.?
So you would think you could put solar panels up there to run your facility, which you can do some partial loading and everything. But there's a safety feature in a solar system that will not produce, well, it'll produce, it will not put power on the line unless it sees utility power, because the solar system also pushes power back into the grid. So if the grid's down and your solar system's kicking along, you're going to kill a lineman. So the solar systems actually take themselves offline when there's no power to the building.
Okay.
Oddly enough.
Bob, if I could just jump in and address that. So one of the things that's happening today with healthcare facilities is they're working with utilities to enter into what's called peak shaving programs or demand load programs, where utilities are actually paying healthcare facilities to be simply prepared to go on emergency power. So when utilities are, having peak demand periods, sometimes it's cheaper for them to pay a healthcare facility to go on generator power than it is to buy the additional power in the marketplace. So we've seen examples where healthcare facilities have been able to finance significant emergency power system expansions through those arrangements. And I think that may be addressed at one of the later panels. But
Yes.
Facilities out here that are contemplating expanding capacities should talk to their utility to ask if there are peak shaving programs in place that might lead to a decision for a larger generator, for example, to be able to participate in that. Final response on the solar question. There is a move in this country for hospitals, more so hospitals and nursing homes, but to adopt combined heat power, CHP, which is natural gas powered systems. Not sure how that's going to square with Florida's on-site fuel requirement. That's probably going to be a snag. But probably a couple hundred hospitals across the country are doing this.
Okay.
And some of them are doing it with incentives from utilities. But there are also efforts to create microgrids. And microgrids are essentially combinations of solar power, other sources of power that you don't get from your utility that you can use for your own facility. So I would encourage facilities in this process of meeting the new requirement to take a step back for a moment and talk with their utility to find out if there are some other options that are worth consideration.
Okay. Well, thank you. So I have we've gone through our questions, and those are excellent questions. Thank you all for submitting them. I think we covered a broad gambit So this is my wrap-up question for you all. Let's take the emergency regulation, let's put it aside. If a nursing home provider came to you and said, I want to put in a generator that powered, it partially powered the air conditioning in my facility to create a refuge for my residents. And I'm going to go to each one of you. And I want to put in 96 hours worth of fuel to power that generator. What would your advice be to the nursing home provider on how to do it? And then how would you advise him as far as a timeline to get it done?
So I've had that request. Worked with several providers around the state of Florida that, again, the contractual obligations and stuff, I don't know how that all played out for them, but so in existing facilities, as you saw that riser diagram, very difficult to isolate HVAC systems. It's possible, but not practical. So the best solution that we've come up with, and I believe most skilled nursing facilities have this at this point as well, is that ahead of your main device, you put a transfer switch that can manage the entire building, so that during an outage, you can go flip a manual transfer switch and put it over to a generator that may or may not be there. So the provider I was working with at the time actually had owned their own trailer-driven generators and fuel tanks that they would position outside the kill zone, whatever you want to call it, and bring them in immediately if they needed them, so that they could flip over and power up the entire building. That is the least intrusive way to pick up your building. Still requires an outage because you're literally playing with the mains to your building. But that piece of switchgear is probably 6 months out by beginning of design to manufacturing. And then the operator has to be committed to owning their own generators. So this was a national provider, so they literally had trailer-driven generators scattered around the country and would, stage them where they needed to when disasters would happen. So to take the least intrusive, probably least costly way of doing it, that's possible. But it's still, between all the permits, design, installation, that was still a 6 to 8 month endeavor in blue sky times.
Well, unlike Bob, when I went to college, I wasn't wrestling between whether to become an electrical engineer or a lobbyist. I didn't have the mental chops to consider engineering. So I'm not an engineer, so my response to this question to any facility is you need a good team of consultants, starting with engineers to design the right facility and help you choose the right equipment and suppliers to meet that need.
You're going to have to hire an engineer to go before to start the process. So whether you team with a vendor who's a supplier that works with the engineer, so you have one point of contact, that's kind of limited by who you are and what your facility is. If you have an engineering manager in your company, maybe he would be the one to run that for you. If not, you may be better served by outsourcing that and having somebody do the project management part of it, bringing that team together, electrical engineer, building contractor, supplier, vendor, all those team effort to get that taken care of. But, you're going to have to start with an engineer, whether you pay them or whether you contract somebody to work them in your behalf.
And just to wrap, at the end of the day, we're just, as a fuel company, we're just supplying the appliance. But I would carry that further because you all are a level 1 customer. Level 1 means that lives are at stake, and we're responsible, as fuel companies are responsible on a priority basis to come get you taken care of. I can't speak for everybody in my industry. I can speak for you from us as Farrell. We have letters that we sign with a variety of customers in the healthcare industry stating that you're a priority, and then we live up to that responsibility, obviously caveated of that tree that's down in the middle of the road and a lake that we have to traverse. But all things being that we can get to your facility, we're going to get there. The same's true with the distributor for the equipment that's going to maintain your equipment. That's because those are, after the specs are in and the drawings are done, the permitted, the equipment's there, you have to live with the people that are going to be there for you when the events actually occur. And so I would spend a lot of time making sure that you got somebody that you can trust when the chips are down.
And so with that, I want to thank you panelists for being here. And we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. But what I especially want to thank you for is with you and your colleagues during the disaster, when Emmett or myself or Tom or Jenny or Melody were in the EOC, and we called and said, we have a nursing home that needs a generator or needs fuel, you all moved heaven and earth to make that happen. And we really reach out to you all and your colleagues, and we thank you guys for being partners during a disaster. And so let's give this panel a hand.